welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to the latest installment of our Media Economics and Entrepreneurship speaker series. I'm very pleased today to have Renee LaBran with us. Coming up, we have a number of events. I also just want to let everybody know here that in April, 1 month from today roughly, we will be having an economist in residence program here. We're going to have someone named David McCourt, who's an entrepreneur, an investor, and someone who has been a pioneer in the communications industry, and he's going to be with us for the better part of a week, visiting classes, giving presentations here, and there's a lot of opportunities to interact with him, so you'll be hearing more about that schedule. Just a word here about some of the speakers we've had so far on the sort of journalism side of this Media Economics and Entrepreneurship speaker series. We had some an analyst here early to kick off the speaker series. We had an entrepreneur. I'm very pleased today that we have Renee LaBran, who comes at media now from a different perspective than a lot of the other people we've heard from. She is actually actively an investor with Rustic Canyon Fontis right now, which is a VC firm. She has a background, however, as a management consultant, and she also worked for the Los Angeles Times at the very beginning of the digital revolution, which is now sort of a quaint term. It wasn't actually all that long ago. And so she sort of saw this transformation of digital distribution very much from the beginning, from a newspaper's the perspective of a newspaper. But now she comes to speak to us as someone who is an investor who looks at this landscape with a different lens. So we don't often get to hear the perspective of investors here in Annenberg, but I'm very pleased today to have Renee with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. We say it wasn't that long ago. It actually, when I started putting this together, I realized it actually was that long ago. And I suddenly felt kind of old. And I was just chatting, Sophie Lafferty, who's over there, actually was in my group when I started at the LA Times, and I was reminding her that my son, who was a baby at that time, is now a freshman in college, and graduated with the young man sitting over there. But so I did suddenly feel quite old. But just to give you a little background, so I was in management consulting, a firm called Monitor Company, and decided I wanted to go do something operational. And at the time, you know, in management consulting, you really spend all your time thinking about industries that are in transition. So when I looked around and I wanted to stay in Los Angeles, well, what industry was about to go through major transition? It was really the media industry. However, at that time, which was the early 90s, it was really pre-internet. And what everyone was worried about was CD-ROMs. Talk about quaint. Seems like, you know, we were all worried that textbooks, and there were these very kind of silly games, you know, that you could do on CD-ROMs, and nothing like what you can do today. We had AOL, we had Prodigy. People weren't really sure what was going to happen. So I went to Times Mirror. I took a job at the LA Times. I was responsible for strategic planning and marketing for one of the advertising groups, actually, which was the classifieds, which were what they were most worried about. And just to give you some perspective, at that time, sort of their peak, that business unit contributed more than the total profits of the paper. Okay, it was so profitable, and of course it's, you know, decimated today. So our job was to figure that out. I also worked on strategic planning. The LA Times was going through some, even back then, some trauma, how to get itself more profitable. Michael Parks isn't here, but he could probably tell you that there was a time at which I was perhaps one of the most hated people in the entire company, if you asked anyone in editorial, because I was sent in to explain that we had to make more money. It almost seems laughable today, but I literally was cursed out by several members of the editorial team that, you know, what the blankety blank did I know. You know, they're all sort of maybe wishing today that maybe they'd been a little bit more cooperative. But so I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about what the you know, what the media landscape looked like at the time, not because I want to take a walk down memory lane, but I think there's a few points that might inform us as to today. And to be quite honest, you know, a lot of my investing today is not media focused. So it was kind of fun for me to really put my thoughts together, and one of my takeaways, which it has been for many years, is that things just circle back around, and I think you'll see when we come to the end that there are some things that we're reliving in today's environment. So a couple of other introductory points. I did this PowerPoint myself. I'm a really lousy PowerPoint person, so, you know, please, like, forgive the ugly colors and, you know, whatever. The second thing is, you know, you have to think about what is media, and the definition of media today, I think, really kind of expands or contracts depending on who you're talking to. I'm taking a fairly broad view of media, probably not as expansive as some might, but, you know, give me a little liberty there as well. So I picked 1996, could have picked 97, 95, whatever. Essentially, it looked like this. We had the pipes, the portals, traditional media, and new media, whatever that was. The pipes, excuse me, the pipes were really how did the internet get to you? Okay, and no one was really quite sure at the time. In fact, well, let me come back to that. The portals were the people aggregating all the information, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. And then we had traditional media and new media. So let's start with the pipes. So the pipes, as I said, were how the internet got to you. We were worried at the time about the phone company. In fact, the LA Times was so worried about the phone company that against my vote, they went into a joint venture with the phone company because they were worried that the phone company was going to control access to everyone's home. It lasted about a year, and then they paid a lot of money to get out of it because it was a bad idea. But you know, it's just interesting when you think back. Everyone was worried about the phone company. Cable actually did not have much penetration at the time. Okay, remember this was dial-up, right? Secondly, the portals. So no one really quite knew what the internet was at the time. So you had to go through these portals. And now you might, you know AOL, you know MSN, you know Yahoo. Depending on your age cohort in this room, you may or may not remember Lycos, Alta Vista, and Excite. Those were leading portals at the time. What these sites did is they aggregated eyeballs. And what we did as content providers was we paid the portals a lot of money for access. So, you know, you wanted to be, when I started, I guess I should have mentioned that one of the other things I did at Times Mirror was we actually put the classifieds online. We were one of the first papers to do that. And then we started a company out of my office called Career Path. It was a joint venture with Tribune and Washington Post and New York Times. And my team helped start that, and I was actually the CEO of that for a year when it got launched. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how many millions of dollars we should pay AOL, MSN, or Yahoo to be the job site on those portals. And it was quite competitive, and you know, it was a lot of money at the time. So, in fact, still is. And then now, just for the little trip down memory lane, this is what Yahoo looked like. Okay, and so I'm seeing Jay's face like, oh my God. So a couple of things just to note. You know, not a lot of graphics. Remember, people were on dial-ups. But this is how people found things, right? So this is why you had to pay the portals, because people didn't really know how to find things on the internet. By the way, there weren't that many websites. And so if I had scrolled down there and saw jobs, I wanted people to click on jobs and get to Career Path. And that's why we would pay millions of dollars. So anyway, I thought that was kind of funny. If you go to this website, Royal Pingdom, you can actually see what some of the other sites look like. They're very, talk about quaint. Traditional media, so newspapers really dominated content in the, you know, as we call it, for news and ad listings. They had the biggest organizations for news gathering, and they had the biggest organizations for ad sales. So it was an interesting time because as everybody was trying to get into media, whether it was AOL, whether it was Microsoft, you know, City Search, who was a new entrant at the time, they all came to the LA Times because what they wanted was access to content, whether it be news or listings. And they all wanted to do joint ventures with us. We were kind of the center of the universe. It was a great time to be in a newspaper. And it was the LA Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, you know, pretty much because we had this national content. TV and radio actually were really struggling at that time. What do we do? Because their content was not very good for the web at the time, and they didn't have a large news gathering operation. The TV tended to be fairly superficial in terms of their news gathering. And then there was new media. So around that time, only about 100,000 websites, not many brands outside of the portals. Maybe a few brands. I mean, some of them, the New York Times had a web presence at the time. Monster was another job website, which is still around. Career Path, by the way, is now Career Builder. We merged at one point. Amazon started around then. There weren't a lot, and most of them, so there weren't a lot of new names. I mean, you know, Amazon and Monster, but, you know, you think about, if you say internet, what's, you know, first name that comes to mind? Maybe Google. Anybody know when Google started? 98. 998 was its launch. So anyway, all right, so what happened? Well, a lot of things happened. First was the shift to broadband, which really changed the game because you went from having to do things like that Yahoo page that you saw to being able to do really rich content online. Cable access improved. Cable actually overtook DSL. I think the last statistics I saw, maybe they were kind of neck and neck again, but for a while, cable was way ahead. Massive growth in household penetration. I think it's something like, I have a stat somewhere in here, but maybe, you know, roughly 75% of U.S. households now have internet access, and of that, 93% is broadband. The portals, you know, I think you all know, you know, most of those sites up there are gone. AOL is going to be the Huffington Post now. Yahoo is struggling. What happened? Well, I would argue Google. Right? People didn't need to go to a directory to figure out where to go. Right? I want to find jobs. I type in jobs, up comes sites. Directed search. Consumers know brands. Remember the first Super Bowl ad for an internet company and people were just astounded? Well, now some of these websites got big enough they can advertise on their own. People know. You don't always have to go in and search. Although sometimes if you watch people who don't really still, you know, haven't really got the internet, they'll go to a search engine and then they'll type in the name of the website. It's because they're still confused about, you know, how this all worked. But, you know, by and large, most people know how to do that. Ads are able to support more sites. There just wasn't a lot of advertising, so economically, not that many sites could survive. On the advertiser front, you know, a couple things. One, people would say, oh, the internet, but you can't advertise brands on the internet. No, not going to happen. Well, of course, it's now a huge source of brand advertising. Listings, I talked about that classified advertising, that has shifted completely. You know, who goes to the newspaper to look for a job or buy a car or find a house, right? And then there's search. In fact, most of the advertising on the internet, a huge percentage of it is actually search, and a huge percentage of that accrues to Google. So that's changed completely. In 1995, the ad revenues were about, according to one source, $9 per user, and in 2009 were $46 per user. I've also seen other numbers much higher. It kind of depends what you count and how you count it. Hardware also has made a huge difference. Mobile, you have the internet everywhere. We're using it on our iPads, we're using it on our cell phones, whatever. We always have the internet with us. These formats have spawned entire new industries. I thought some of these statistics were quite amazing. So Apple, 120 million users of iPhone, iPad, and iTouch, 111% year-over-year growth. That's just amazing. And since launch, 15 million iPads. I mean, you know, and it's completely transformed how we interact with media, right? I mean, I don't want to be overdramatic, but it really has. Technologies, you've got mobile, video, which I have bold here because video has finally emerged. You couldn't do video years ago. Even 5 years ago, video was difficult. I mean, you know, it's still quirky from time to time, right? You try to stream things, it hangs up. But video is huge, and GPS. You've all had these little GPS things in your phones for years. You didn't even know you had them. And now they're finally turned on, and people are doing things with them. But they've all been there a long time. People have been trying to do things with them for years, right? But sometimes you have to get all the pieces right. You know, one thing I didn't put on here, but I just thought I would mention, is also, as a result of all of this, how we spend our time with media has really changed. And we now, we might think that the internet is the media you spend most of your time with, and it might be, and it differs by age, but 31%, excuse me, of media time is still spent on TV. And the internet is 28. Newspapers, sadly, are 12. But you might even be surprised to know they're that high. Now, another little interesting point there, though, is that the advertising is out of whack. So for the 31% of time spent on TV, they get 39% of the ad dollars. Newspapers are 12%, and they still get 26% of the advertising. Okay, the internet is 28, but only gets 13% of the advertising. So there's still potential there for quite a lot more advertising. So just to summarize some of that, where are we today? Pipes are a commodity. I mean, how many offers do you get in your mailbox for cheaper internet access? You know, if you bundle this with your phone, you can have this, and if you bundle this with cable, you get that. Content is everywhere, as I mentioned. The portals are dead. Search is the king. We've gone from a few 100,000 websites to literally a few 100 million websites, and more just come and go every day. Newspapers are struggling, TV's hanging in there, and video is taken off. So, where is the value? So we want to talk about money. So this is a comparison. Companies on the left that we would consider new media. Companies on the right we would call old media. Give me, you know, a little latitude here. Some of these I know are a little shady, but you know, you could argue which side. But by and large, these are companies on the right that, you know, were around in the old days, and they're all, with maybe the exception of Apple, new companies here. Now, I didn't put Microsoft on here. Microsoft certainly has a major media presence, but as a percentage of their business, media is a much smaller percentage. So, left it off. So, Google, you know, tops them all. So, you know, there's some other companies I didn't include on here. IAC is one you might know. There are 3 billion. Ancestry.com is 1.5 billion. You know, whether or not you want to call that media. But, you know, interestingly, I mean, these are, you know, not trivial. Gannett's 4 billion, Washington Post 3.5, you know, poor New York Times down here, 1.5 billion. Times Mirror, you know, went to Tribune, bankrupt, but that's another story. But just a few interesting comparisons on here. So think about 10 years ago, and you asked any parent, what brand does your kid think about the most? They would probably say Disney, right? Ask any parent with teenagers today, what brand does your kid think about the most today? It's Facebook, right? They're on Facebook all the time.
You left a number off Apple. It's 380 billion.
Oh my gosh.
Not 37 billion. It's by far the largest market cap company.
You know what? I got probably their revenues on there. You're right. I apologize. Apple, but look at Netflix and think about $11 billion for Netflix and compare that to a cable company. Cable company basically, you know, does the same thing as Netflix. It delivers content to your TV, right? So you know, they're still not as big as the cable companies, but considering how long they've been around, not so bad. And if other than Apple, if I had the revenues up there, you'd see that as a multiple of revenue, that is far greater than what the cable companies get. A few other comparisons, Zynga, which does games, compare that to EA. You know, again, it's surpassed EA. I thought this one was kind of interesting. McGraw-Hill and Demand Media. I don't know if you all know Demand Media. They basically aggregate all these, you know, little sites. They'd go out and find people who had little content sites, and they'd say, you know, we'll buy you, and then we can optimize advertising around that. So here you have McGraw-Hill with like serious publishing, right, and been around forever, and Demand Media, which, you know, you can argue whether or not you think there's any quality there or not. We won't get into that, but, you know, a third of the market cap of McGraw-Hill. Just another interesting little point on here. If you look at number of users, Google has close to 1 billion users. Facebook, 620 million. On the website it says 500, but I've seen 620. Apple, 120 million users. So again, just how do those users translate into value? Now, then I have labeled these as content and distribution. And again, you know, some of these are a little bit, you could argue, if they have both, so you look at Google, I mean, Google definitely has content and it has distribution. Seems to me the companies that can do distribution have been able to capture more value. And if you can do both, you are really good, right? So distribution wins again, right? So think back to the landscape in 95, 96, 97, where the portals controlled everything. Once again, distribution matters. Content, not so bad, but something else has happened with content. It has fragmented tremendously, right? So, you know, we've got these newspapers, but none of these companies are dominant. I mean, think about a company like CBS. We didn't go back before the internet, but CBS, NBC, ABC, they were essentially portals, right? I mean, you had to get programming onto the television. You had to go through a network. They had, you know, they were huge value, but they've lost tremendous value over the years. So, but on the left, when you look at content, you just see huge fragmentation. You also see another phenomenon, which we'll get to, which is sort of a changing definition of content. So think about something like Yelp, right? I mean, is it content? Is it advertising? What is it? I mean, people would argue that it's content. It's user-generated content. People put their thoughts on there. I like this restaurant. I don't like this, you know, whatever, this car wash. But that's content, right? So Huffington Post, blogs, mostly, you know, they have paid journalists, but still it's content, right? But just fragmenting and a broadening definition. Not unlike what happened in the TV market, where you had fragmentation brought on by cable. And everybody lost share. They didn't go away, but it fragmented. I think you're seeing that on the content, on the media side as well. So distribution, still big, and if you can do both. I mean, think about how many articles you've read about Apple's lock, iTunes lock on distribution, right? I mean, that's the value, right? It's the old razor and razor blade, you know? But it's worked for them, right? So if you can make it work, huge value be created. Now, the other element overlaying all this, of course, is social media, right? And if you look at which of these companies could be considered social media, I think in terms of new media, you see a bias there. I mean, a company that distributes coupons, come on, right? In the old newspaper days, coupons, people pay. There were companies that aggregated coupons, and they paid newspapers to distribute them for them. Great business. But now, here's a company that has maybe $500 million in revenues, maybe more. They were offered $6 billion and they turned it down, right? This is in a few years. I mean, it's unbelievable, really, when you think about it. Let's talk a little bit more about social media. I just want to throw out some Facebook data to give you, you've probably seen some of these figures, but they are staggering. More than 500 million active users. I think I said earlier, I saw another source earlier that was 620 million. 70% outside the US. Even if you take that lower number, that's still a lot of people in the US. 150 million. 50%, this is just off their website, 50% of our active users log on in any given day. People spend over 700 billion minutes per month on Facebook. Just like, God, what has that done to productivity in the US? More than 2.5 million websites have integrated with Facebook. So most of the major sites in some way are connected to Facebook. 200 million through their mobile devices. And by the way, if you can access it on your mobile device, you're more likely to use it because, of course, you get these messages all day and you respond, right? And then I threw the last one in there, estimated $1.1 billion in revenue, right? Which actually isn't that much considering the market value, right? So, and who knows what the number really is, but it just goes to show kind of the value, the multiples that these companies get. Now, the next slide is very pretty. I did not do this. I borrowed it from a friend who gave me permission to use it, Renee Fraser, who runs an ad agency called Fraser Communications. And she put her agency put this beautiful slide together and said I could use it. And I love it, one, because not just because it's so pretty, but because I think it shows you how many different ways social media has been turned into businesses, right? It's not just Facebook. Facebook is certainly the granddaddy, but they're down here, the social networks. You've got High Five, which is largely international, but you have niche networks. So some of you may be on LinkedIn, some of you may have used Plaxo to update your contacts. You've got the customer service networks like a Yelp. You have Twitter, and then you have a whole Twitter ecosystem of companies that are just about helping you manage your Twitter accounts. A variety of things. The blogs, blogs are interesting because there was this, and still is perhaps, this whole phenomenon of blogs where people were blogging, right? So what is a blog now? I saw an article, can't remember where it was, a few weeks ago, do we need blogs anymore, right? And do people still blog? Well, I think, again, it's sort of like media. What's your definition of a blog? So if people tweet, that's a microblog. If I put something on Facebook as a status, that's sort of a microblog, right? But at the time, blogs are a way for me to get my thoughts out. People would come read them. Now they can read, what I have to say every 10 minutes if I send out tweets, which I don't. But, if I had something that impressive to say, maybe I would. But anyway, a whole ecosystem of things here just related to the social media landscape. She's labeled it here the conversation. A lot of marketers now talk about the art of conversation, having a conversation with your customers. If you think back to, again, the old days, direct mail was really an attempt to do one-on-one marketing. It never really fulfilled that promise because we spent so much time trying to figure out, who lived in every house and could we segment it this way and that way. And, hey, Michael, it never really fulfilled its promise. But when the internet emerged, we all thought, wow, here's really a way to do one-on-one marketing. And that is really where all these companies are trying to get to. And that's what Facebook's trying to figure out. And, the problem they have, of course, is every time they creep into that, little personalization on the ads, people scream, and then they have to backtrack on their privacy policies, right? So it'll get there. It will get there. It's already probably doing more personalization than you care to acknowledge. But again, you can go through the wide range of companies here, and new ones come and go every day, right? So that's really the social marketing. Now, I think that social media raises some dilemmas that I'm sure that you've all talked about in your journalism classes. But, one, do people understand the difference between opinion and fact? I'm not sure that they always do. But I read it on Facebook. Well, just because your friend said it on Facebook doesn't mean it's true. Can we trust our friends or the crowds to supply the truth? And certainly, as we've seen Twitter reports coming out of various hot spots, people wonder, what's real, what's not real, right? I mean, you don't know, right? I mean, it can be used just like any other form of media. It can be used. And what about privacy? As I mentioned, this one-on-one direct marketing, it's kind of creepy sometimes, but do we care? I don't know. Some people don't. They think it's great. And now, the big question, who pays for real journalism, right? So if we have all these people blogging and saying, here's what I think about, what's going on in the Middle East, well, who is paying for those investigative reporters to actually go and report to you the, quote, truth, right? Now, investigative journalism costs a ton of money, and there are people here who can talk much more eloquently than I can about the cost of it. But it certainly is not done in a complete way by somebody who's sending, 120 words on their cell phone. Directory information is now content. We talked about Yelp. And then, interestingly, the money comes back to the aggregators, not always to the creators. So, think about that. The Huffington Post, to me, was kind of interesting. So $315 million, not the biggest company on the list. But how many people got paid for any of that content on there? Right? Who made the money? The people that put those things all together. The people that made Huffington Post popular, very few of them got paid. Right? I mean, they just thought it was fun to put their blogs up there and have people read them. So, that's unusual, right? Because in, most aggregation, at least, the content providers got paid something, right? And certainly Apple has been has made sure the content provider gets paid something, and that's been a tug of war. But the real money is getting made by Apple. It's getting made by Huffington Post. It's getting made by Google. The people who are aggregating either eyeballs or content, right? Because it's very hard for any one small fragment of media to get found on the internet when there's hundreds of millions of websites. But if I have money to spend on ads and promotion, I can do that. Don't have to go through a portal anymore, but I can get found. So, lots of issues around social media, but nevertheless, it's here. It has penetrated our lives. The fastest growing group on Facebook is over 65. It's not just our kids. So, where is the innovation today? Well, interestingly, it's at big companies. Apple, Netflix, Amazon, Google. I think we would argue that those companies are all pretty innovative. Startups. Again, some astounding numbers. I mentioned Groupon. I think I said 500 million before. 800 million in revenue now was another estimate I found in 2010, up from 33 million in 2009. How many companies grow that fast? Not very many. Gilt Group, again, is that a media company? I don't know. Do all of you know Gilt? So Gilt was the first what they call flash sale company, and so it's basically like an outlet online. And you go on and, there's only 5 of these dresses and you buy them. And if, you can buy a $5,000 dress for $600 or, and they've got all sorts of stuff on there. But what's interesting is it's not just a place to buy something. It's not like Amazon where I go and search till I find the, the pen that I want to buy. It's actually kind of entertainment. There are people whose lives revolve around getting onto this site right when the sales open at 9 a.m., and buying whatever, dress happens to be there. I mean, you could argue, that's content, right? That's their form of entertainment. They're spending a lot of money for it, but anyway, $500 million in 2010. They haven't been around that long. It is amazing, and then they've spawned other competitors, but it is quite fast. So Foursquare, some of you may know, 7 million users, up from 1 million in May 2010. Okay, so you go, if you haven't used Foursquare, you go into this restaurant, and it, checks you, you check in, it knows, so on Facebook it says, Renee just checked in at whatever restaurant. So now all my friends know where I am, and if they're nearby, they can tell me. Now, people tried to do this, a couple of years ago with phones, but remember I told you those little GPS things were not all turned on. Well, they're all turned on now, and everybody has the iPhones, and everyone's checking in on Foursquare. Now, just think about the privacy issues there. People know where I am, and if they really, were clever, they could figure out not only like where did I come from, how often do I go places. I don't know that that can all be tracked right now, but it could be, right? Someone will figure out how to do that. So huge privacy issues, but people don't seem to be worried about it. I mean, they're signing up everywhere, right? So. And then, of course, Twitter, 175 million users at the end of 2010, up from 58 million the prior year. So, lots of innovation going on. And what I think is interesting about this, actually, let me just go. These are not kind of new inventions, per se, right? So Gilt Group, I mean, shopping outlets, I mean, that was, but they've turned that into content. They've really changed a whole business model. Coupons, that was, a form of advertising for, many years. And now it's, one of the fastest growing businesses in America. Foursquare, again, not necessarily a media company, but I think because it's integrated into this whole social media ecosystem, hard to ignore, and certainly Twitter. How do people get revenues? We've talked about value. But I think, as I mentioned, value doesn't always correspond to revenues in today's world. U.S. internet advertising, $26 billion in 2010, up from $12 billion in 2005, according to eMarketer. More than half of that is search. And of course, try as everybody might, Google still has 70% market share when it comes to search, right? So Bing has made some inroads, but by and large, Google. Facebook, we've talked about. So CPMs are the way people pay for advertising. So I want to access 1,000 readers. What do I pay? Right? In the newspaper business, we used to get them all over the map, but these would have been considered very low in newspaper days. So $10 plus at the high end, so very targeted business and financial users, down to 55 cents for social marketing sites, which is kind of interesting when you consider that social marketing is where it's supposed to be the most targeted, right? But they haven't really been able to fully exploit that personal marketing because of some pushback and privacy issues. But I think you'll see that number going up as they figure it out. Now, Google is interesting. Do you all know what AdSense is? When you search for Google and you get on Google and you get all little ads on the side, well, that's AdSense. So they pay, and then if you are a website and you let them run little ads along the side for search, they'll share the revenue with you. So they actually support a lot of small media sites. In fact, many of the sites that Demand Media bought up were all supported by AdSense. So again, they've helped support all these small companies, but still the aggregators came along and pulled them all together. So even though you could make a little bit of money on AdSense, you still went on Huffington Post, they still went to Demand Media. The aggregators won. History just repeats itself. But I wanted to throw in here too, advertising $26 billion on the internet, but e-commerce is $166 billion. So we spend a lot of money on the internet, up from $28 billion in 2000. So there's still a long way to go. And some of the statistics I gave you earlier about how the internet is really underrepresented in terms of the dollars of media that it gets, dollars of advertising that it gets relative to its share of audience. I think as part of this problem, the CPMs are just very low, right? So, and just to give you some perspective, when we had people back in the old days who would pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a help wanted listing on the LA Times. Today, you can run a job posting, for $120. You can run one for free on Craigslist if you want. It's just people, the whole idea of how much I was willing to pay changed. Of course, the audiences were much smaller and people, argued about which was better, but they still haven't, even though the audiences have grown, they haven't really caught back up. So, innovation in all kinds of things. One way to think about innovation is also in the business model. So in media, you can make, just to explain how advertising works, you can make money in advertising. The viewers can pay subscriptions, pay-per-view, single copy. You can make money off selling services, whether it's technology or information. People gather up lots of information about how people use the internet, and then people make money off of that, and then there's support. But you can present these things in new ways. So apps, huge business, right? Who even knew what an app was, a few years ago, right? But now we buy lots of apps. Apple Newsstand, same business. We've all bought books. We've all bought newspapers. We've all bought, whatever, magazines, but now we buy them on the Apple Newsstand. Netflix, iTunes, Pandora, all new ways to present old business models. The Kindle, you didn't normally think about books as a razor and razor blade kind of business, but there you have it. People, Kindle, they don't share all their data, but people buy more books now because of Kindle. And then virtual items. Who would think you would pay for silly nothings that you can send to people on the internet, right? But people pay $1 to send a badge or something to their friends on the internet. So, old business models presented in new ways. Another way to think about innovation is that it is really the intersection of new technologies and old ideas. So, again, we've talked about some of the innovations we've seen in media. You can think about media as it intersects with mobile and the opportunities that presented, be it Twitter or otherwise, location, be it Foursquare or otherwise, social media, and e-commerce. Okay? I don't think that 10, 15, 20 years ago that these things were all as integrated as they are today. And on the far side over there, hardware, again, hardware has just had a dramatic impact on all of this. It's hard to talk about media without talking about the hardware. Right? These platforms have created huge opportunities. Groupon we've talked about, it's just such a phenomenal example, but social networks enabling advertising. Linking my social network to my geography, re-aggregation of content. I think re-aggregation is another big theme that we see. It's not just the Huffington Post re-aggregating blogs. It's Flipboard, if any of you have seen that on Facebook. It basically pulls all the articles that your friends are sending to you and magazines. It creates a magazine for you. That's basically, it looks like a glossy magazine that's a creation from all the articles and postings that your friends have done. So they're re-aggregating it and presenting it to you in a new way that I couldn't really do before I had an iPad, right? So interesting the way they've pulled that all together. Fastest growing, you had to sign up and wait because they couldn't even add users fast enough. They just couldn't get enough. They didn't have enough bandwidth. Evernote, different kind of media problem, but you go through your day, and all day you're thinking, oh my God, I got to save this article. I have this little email. I want to pull these all together. Well, Evernote is another fast-growing application that lets you. It's kind of a virtual clipboard, right? So it's a way for me to manage my media, but again, it's around this concept of re-aggregation. And lastly, I think this has all created new ways to entertain yourself. Angry Birds. It sounds like it should have been a horror movie, but yet it is like the fastest growing game, and millions of people play Angry Birds all day. Again, this whole productivity problem, we are not doing so well. So we've talked about all the different ways people innovate. We've talked about some of the themes. But what really gets funded? So from a venture capital perspective, the first thing, what's the idea? What need is it fulfilling? So the thing that's a challenge here is sometimes we don't even know what need we have, right? I mean, when Twitter first started getting people were like, really? Like, why do I need that? I don't need to send 120, word blogs around, and I don't want to know what all these people are doing. And, people, oh, it's a flash. But, if someone had said that, right? But then again, if someone had said, eBay would be billions of dollars today when, 20 years ago it was selling Beanie Babies and Pez dispensers, sometimes just it's hard to know, right? These entrepreneurs are quite visionary. That's part of the definition of an entrepreneur. So what need is it filling? How big is that need? Then what's the business model and the resulting revenue and profit potential? Now again, sometimes that's hard to know, and there are people who have started businesses and said, you know what, as long as I can get millions and millions of eyeballs, then I'll figure out how to make money. Again, that happened years ago. Remember all the free email? Remember something like Hotmail, right? Hotmail was sold years ago for what was a lot. It was a lot of money at the time. Don't remember the exact numbers, but nobody paid for it. It was free email. It cost a lot to deliver that service, but what they had was lots and lots of eyeballs. And over time, they were able to put advertising on that email. They, became a big business. So there's always been this idea that if you can aggregate the eyeballs, you will figure out a way to make money. It's not that novel a concept. Newspapers worried a lot about their circulation, right? And they were delivering eyeballs. That's what they were doing. Some things just don't change, right? So what's the resulting revenue? What's the profit potential? And if it's a big idea, can the team execute and do so before someone else does? I'm sure if you've all seen The Social Network, the Winklevi, whatever those twins are still in court trying to get their share of Facebook, and maybe they had a similar idea, maybe they didn't, who knows, but whatever, they didn't make a lot of money, and the guy who did is going to be maybe one of the wealthiest men in the world. So last question, can it be sustained? That is one of the interesting things about this sector right now, that how long are the innovation cycles? So you think about aggregation, we talked about it was the networks, then it was the portals, now it's Facebook and Google. They haven't been around that long. Can they stay there? Now, lots of value has been created in the meantime. I'm sure that the guys who made money off all those businesses won't care if it goes down tomorrow. They've got their billions. But that is a critical question. And once you get out of that stratosphere, a lot of these businesses are popular, and then they kind of fall off the map as soon as the next website comes along that does it just a little better. So let's see. So in conclusion, just right on time here, if we've learned anything, it's that change can happen fast. But even so, newspapers aren't entirely gone, right? And we talk about them like they're dead, and in many terms they are, in financial sense, they certainly have their problems, but they're not entirely gone. And some of those newspaper companies were still worth a few $1 billion, which is, more than most of us have. TV and radio, they're still around, right? When the internet came, everybody said TV and radio are dead. They're not dead. Everything fragments, right? Just happens over and over. In a hyper-connected world, the adoption cycles can be exponential. That's the good news, but it's also the bad news, right? Here today, the next guy's here today, right? So it definitely creates a new competitive dynamic. Innovation happens when entrepreneurs look at new ways to do old things. They solve new problems, or they mix and match new and old technologies and multiple data sets. Right? So kind of the whole idea of location and, friends, I mean, who thought, right? But of course, it makes perfect sense, right? Lessons from the past. Media at least in my opinion, always fragments. If you go back over time, that's what happens, right? There's one newspaper, then there's two newspapers. Then there's one website, there's more. It fragments. It has to, because somebody always comes along and says, I can do a better job. Or I can do a little better job for those people over there. So it fragments. Controlling the distribution channel seems to have always been a pretty good deal. But it's very hard to stay dominant over time. Now, CBS, ABC, NBC, they made money at being the distribution channel for a very, very long time, and they're still making money, right? So, on the other hand, AOL, Yahoo, those companies, their lifespan does not appear to be as long. And there were a whole bunch of other portals that just fell by the wayside, as we talked about. But lastly, if you have distribution and content, you can really make some serious money. So if you have great ideas how to do distribution and content, I encourage you to go out and follow those visions. And remember, me, that you heard it here, and shoot me a few shares. That's it.
Thank you. So we have some time left for questions. Folks in the audience, Jonathan, you want to start off?
Three things. Isn't Facebook just the new portal? They announced today they were going to distribute movies with Warner Brothers. So it's nothing new. Secondly, I would argue that fragmentation is actually going the other way. We have 450 cable channels today. In 3 years, we'll have 200.
Right.
So it feels to me like these are just cyclical factors. And there's to say there's going to be more fragmentation is not really true.
Well, I think what I said was that in every segment it fragments, and then over time some of the competitors die out. So in newspapers, you had one newspaper in a market, and then you had two or three newspapers in a market, and then now it's down to one, or maybe zero, right? But you have some other segment that's fragmenting. Because what happens is, there's still only this much of a pie, right? So it fragments, and not everybody has enough to live on, because now some of the money is getting siphoned off by whatever this new world is. So just because it's not fragmenting into the same segment doesn't mean it's not fragmenting. It's just you have more formats, and then you have more sites within that format. But I completely agree that businesses die off. They do. I do think it's a natural cycle.
So if content and distribution always wins, why did Time Warner spin off its distribution?
I think it did a very bad job of executing. But I also think that they were trying to mix old distribution and new content. Certainly in the new media world, it has managed. But the problem is that the distribution they had, there were three things that got split out, right? You had AOL, you had the cable, Time Warner Cable, and then you had the Time Warner content, right? I think AOL was dying because it was a portal. But the distribution that they own, the cable companies, those were pipes, right? And it's just a pipe. So.
But it's distribution. Yeah.
Right, but if you remember that, turn it off. But remember all those cable companies. They were, the cable companies are not, unfortunately, the right kind of distribution, right? There's distribution of content. And maybe I didn't express it clearly enough, but I think there's a difference between being a pipe and being a distributor, where you actually are controlling access to content. Cable, to me, is just a pipe, right? I have to deliver. I'm regulated to a large extent. I have to deliver whoever pays me to send something through, right? But if I'm a aggregator, people are going to see what I put out there. So I don't think that it's this. I don't think.
You don't think Time Warner Cable controls my access to ESPN? Of course it does.
Sure, but what happens when they try to cut off ESPN? They didn't have the leverage. We remember there was a whole thing, in New York where they were, was it ABC, and they were trying to shoot down, they were arguing over who was going to pay, right? Well, if I'm not delivering the biggest stations, I mean, they're a pipe. In my opinion, I think, it's commodity. Yeah, they do have some leverage, and that's why they make money. But I think it's difficult, but it doesn't control things in the same way that, Facebook can put information out in front of people. So it's a, commodity distribution versus a platform, I guess.
You're out there investing.
Mm-hmm.
What are you investing in? What are you buying? What business? What are you excited
Right.
about? What do you think is the hot ticket?
So I think one thing I sort of mentioned in passing, you might not have caught, I'm actually not investing in media right now. I'm in around 05, 06, I think the media market became very difficult. There were far more sites starting up than there were ad dollars available. And even if you look today, there are a few websites that are garnering huge amounts of value. And if you look at what some of the big VC firms are doing, they are going into rather than starting companies, they're saying, wow, I want to get into Twitter, or I want to get into Groupon, or whatever, and they're investing at a very late stage at huge valuations. So when you invest at something at a $6 billion valuation, I mean, come on, it's for you to make money. You're betting that in the next few years it's going to be worth $100 billion. It might be, but there's only a few of those. So, and in the whole media downturn, it was especially quite difficult. So I actually have been spending more time. The fund, Rustic Canyon Fontis Partners, that I manage now is actually, we would like to do media, late-stage media, but we actually haven't found any late-stage media. And by late-stage media, companies invest maybe around $20 million in revenues. So what's been happening is you have a whole bunch of companies that get $2 or $3 million and they're kind of stuck down there, or they get this, and then you have a handful of companies that have this meteoric rise, and there's just not a lot in between. So, I think it's a great time for consumer goods. We've been investing really in specialty consumer goods, which is kind of back more to my roots pre-media. Food companies, niche food companies have been very successful. So I'm sorry to say that to a bunch of media people, but I think it's a difficult space. I think there's a ton of money going into all these digital media companies. There's so many billions of dollars being invested into so many companies, and so few are going to make it. And there's so much money sitting on the sidelines right now that I think it's really difficult. But if I were just thinking about, investing in the market, there are many options out there, and you can place your own bets as to who, which of those companies you think in 5 years, are going to be at the top of the list.
I think we have time for maybe two real quick questions here.
Sorry, you were, did you get answered? Okay. Okay. All right. Other questions?
I'm just curious about, I've heard a lot about lack of VC funding that goes towards women. I was happy to see a woman VC, first off. But maybe you could talk a little bit about whether your company has thought about that at all, why that's the case, or why we see so, and whether you guys are considering that at all?
Well, at Rustic, when I started with Rustic Canyon, the early stage venture fund, it was myself and 7 guys. There are very few women partners in the business. There are more, actually in the life sciences end of the business. I think it's many things. It's one, where they come from. To invest in life sciences, you really have to have been in the science end, I think, in the science end of the business for a long time. And so there are a number of women who go into healthcare or the medical field and then are able to invest. In my end of the business, a lot of people come out of investment banking. A lot come out of investment banking. And that is a very male business. I can direct you to a number of studies. I just came back, in fact, from a Women in Private Equity conference It is amusing that you have to have an industry conference that is just for women, and we all fit in this one hotel. People come from all over the country, but people have done some interesting white papers you could search for online. There's been a couple, and generally stems from the reasons you would think, how people get into the industry. I don't mean to offend people, but when people think about, who do I want to ask to come along to this party with me, they think about people generally who are like themselves. And so the guys invite the guys, and they start a firm, and that's how it happens. So, and the other place that VCs come from is that entrepreneurs, and that also tends to be a more male-dominated career for different reasons. Men biologically are greater risk takers. Not 100%, but there have been actually studies, demonstrating that, and that maybe if we'd had more women on the trading floor, we wouldn't have had the financial crisis. And and also I think socially, it's harder for women to take that kind of risk because you're giving up your career and you're going to work for no money, and you're going to work long hours. And when I got my kids, I don't want to do that. So. There's a lot of reasons. I think it's getting a little better. It hasn't got a lot better. I do see more young women in the business, but they do tend to drop out just as they do from investment banking. So,
one last question here.
Anybody want to argue with me about portals?
Thank you.
Yeah.